In this week's episode, I want to discuss navigating the emotional roller coaster of my wife's heart surgery. I'll keep this short, but I want you to understand the strategies I am using to reduce risk and, more importantly, keep my sanity. Cue the music.
Welcome to the Repurpose Your Career podcast, brought to you by Career Pivot. This podcast is where those of us in the second half of life come together to discuss how to repurpose our careers for the 21st century. Come listen to career experts give you proven strategies. Listen to people like you tell their stories on how they repurpose their careers. And finally, get your questions answered. Your host, Mark Miller, has made 6 career pivots over the last 30 years. He understands this is not about jumping out of the frying pan into a fire, but rather to create a plan where you make clear, actionable steps or pivots to a better future career. Are you ready to repurpose your career?
Welcome to episode 331 of the Repurpose Your Career podcast. My name is Mark Miller, and I'll be your host every Monday for a discussion on what it's like to repurpose your career. In this week's episode, I want to discuss navigating the emotional roller coaster of my wife's heart surgery. I'll keep this short, but I want you to understand the strategies I am using to reduce risk and, more importantly, keep my sanity. I'm going to jump into this episode and forego most of the normal things I discuss in the episode introduction. For my new listeners, my wife and I have lived in Ajijic, Mexico for the last 5 years, which is in the state of Jalisco, only a short distance south of Guadalajara, the second largest city in Mexico, and the home of a number of the country's best medical schools. Healthcare here on the private side is mostly frictionless. Access to the private healthcare system is easy and affordable. The same cannot be said about the public healthcare system, and I'll put a link in the show notes when I discuss the public healthcare system in a previous episode. To see a specialist, you can usually schedule an appointment in less than 2 weeks and often much faster than that. Recently, I went to schedule my annual skin check with my dermatologist and was able to secure an appointment for the next day. My doctor was not rushed and spent over 30 minutes with me. Past appointments have lasted up to an hour. The cost was about $60 US. That was not a copay, but the total cost. I am far more likely to see my doctors, and in between appointments, I can call or text them via WhatsApp. If I have a question, I will text them, and usually I'll get a response in a few hours directly from the doctor. My wife has real relationships with all of her doctors, which includes a hematologist, an endocrinologist, a dermatologist, a gastroenterologist, and now a cardiologist. My wife, being a retired RN, is a total pain-in-the-butt patient, and she loves her doctors here. So I think that sets the stage for this story. So my wife had been noticing a higher than usual heart rate. She felt her pulse racing at times and started taking her pulse. And my wife has a very low heart rate, usually in the 60s. And so she attributed it to possibly her thyroid replacement medication. So she scheduled an appointment with her endocrinologist, which she does every 6 months. She just went to the lab, had blood work done, which was directly emailed directly to the endocrinologist and directly to my wife. On a Monday, she had an appointment. She went in, the endocrinologist listened to her heart and said, "This ain't right." She went next door, got the EKG machine from the cardiologist. Technician came in, hooked it up, they ran it, and immediately the endocrinologist went next door and got the cardiologist, Dr. Briseño. So Dr. Briseño came in and said, you need to come see me. And they made an appointment for the following Thursday. This is on a Monday midday. She then had an appointment in the afternoon on Thursday. Tried doing that in the U.S. She came in on Thursday. They did the sonograms and all the special stuff. At the end, he wrote some prescriptions, handed her a DVD, which has all of the data on it. And that's typical of how the medical system here works. You're given everything electronically, usually on a DVD. The cost for the tests, Dr. Preseno's visit, all the prescriptions ran about $400. In my opinion, pretty reasonable. So she was handed that and a report, which she brought home. The report was in Spanish. You can use Google Translate. I now use DeepL, which I find is a better translator. He was basically explaining my wife needed surgery. And he put her on a blood thinner and something to slow her heart rate down. Within a day, she was feeling her normal self. And they didn't put very many restrictions on her. So at the same time, what am I doing? I should say my wife has the choice. She can have the surgery done here in Mexico and pay the entire amount, which we've been told right now is about 1 million Mexican pesos, which comes out to be about $60,000 or $59,000, depending on the exchange rate. And that's total cost. Or she can go back to the U.S. and have it done and have it covered by Medicare. We do not have a Medigap plan. And along with travel and the deductibles, the cost still will be considerable. So one of the first things I did was reach out to my son, Alex, whose father-in-law is a doctor, I believe a gastroenterologist in Houston. And I got in contact with our son's father-in-law and sent him the reports. He looked at it, showed it to a cardiologist and said, yeah, she's probably going to need surgery. He asked for the DVD. That was one of the interesting ones was I have nothing that can read a DVD, and I didn't want to send him my only copy. So I posted on a Facebook group here in Mexico saying, how can I get a copy of this DVD? And this was on a Saturday, and I wanted to send it out Monday morning. And a nice gentleman popped up, said, yeah, I can copy it for you, but you'll need a blank DVD, which I couldn't find anywhere locally. I could have ordered it off Amazon, but that would have taken a week to get to me. So I ended up copying it to a flash drive, and which is now up in the cloud, and they wouldn't accept the data in Dropbox or Google Drive. So I sent off the DVD on Monday, and I'm recording this on Thursday afternoon, July 27th, and the DVD had just gotten there. So we will be getting a second opinion. I'm convinced they'll tell us, yes, she needs surgery. We're now starting to understand what all our options are. We will very likely right now fly to Houston, see the cardiologist up there. We see the cardiologist here in a week, and we should have a pretty good idea of what surgery she's going to have, how we're going to do it. And I've been discussing this situation on my newsletter, and anybody else would be willing to listen to me. I've sent out several Facebook direct messenger messages to a number of people here about who they used for similar procedures. Everyone's using Dr. Preseno. Everyone loves him. And discussing what all the ways, the machinations of dealing with the healthcare system here, particularly dealing with payments, because there's a lot of negotiation that goes on. So what we end up paying will be interesting. I've had a bunch of people come back to me and say, yes, I know someone who's had a procedure similar to that, and they are doing well. They were not, it really has shown me how much technology has come into play to allow to do this very non-invasively. It's done orthoscopically. That's probably not the right word, but where they go in through a vein, and they can do an awful lot, and the recovery period is pretty minimal. So We'll know in a week, so I've been out gathering data as much as I can to reduce my own anxiety. I discussed in another podcast episode that I will link about dealing with risk, and I'm using all the strategies I discussed in that podcast episode in dealing with this risk. So right now, we would prefer to have the operation done here in Mexico. It'll cost us considerably more, but I'm a recovering engineer. I have money stashed aside for these kinds of events. So I can afford it. I don't like spending it, but we can afford it. And we'll see how we can mitigate the cost. And hopefully within the next 2 to 3 weeks, my wife will get operated on. Number one, thank you to everyone who's been responding to me. If you have some advice for me, please send it to podcast@careerpivot.com. I'd appreciate it. My wife is getting a lot more comfortable with it. She has, at this point, no symptoms. The doctor has not limited very much of her activity. They basically said don't fall down and bleed a lot because she's on blood thinners. Other than that, she's allowed to do her normally daily schedule. We're going to go with the flow. Again, thank you to everyone who has been offering advice, encouragement, and anything else. Just pump me up. Thank you very much. Thank you for that. Take a moment, go to careerpivot.com, sign up for the weekly Career Pivot Insights newsletter, which is sent out every Sunday. You will get a weekly update on this podcast, white papers, and new blog posts. While there, do not forget to check out the Career Pivot community, which can be found at careerpivot.com/community. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. Thank you for listening all the way to the end of the Repurpose Your Career podcast. You will find all the show notes at careerpivot.com/episode-331. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Podbeam, Overcast, Spotify, Pandora, Amazon Music, and lots of other places where podcasts can be found. In fact, this podcast can be found on the Repurpose Your Career podcast channel on YouTube. Hope to see you next Monday for another episode of the Repurpose Your Career podcast.